Hi guys, and welcome back, and today we'll get on with making part 1 of the diorama base for the first encounter diorama. So this will be the biggest and probably most involved diorama base that I've ever made. It's got some moving parts, it will have some flashing lights to simulate fire, and it will have real smoke. So part of the starting point was, how do I house the electrical supply and the smoke generator and the lights in a way that I don't have cables or leads hanging out of the thing, and that I can have access to them pretty simply and easily. And certainly in the initial stages, that was partly driven by the need to be able to replace batteries. So started off here, as you can see, drawing lots of lines on some 3mm MDF, which I like because I can just cut it with my hobby knife after a few passes. And that is to create a little drawer that's going to house all of the technical components of the diorama. So no plan survives contact with the enemy. Someone really smart said that once. And I'd made my drawer too deep. So a little bit of repair on the fly. And then I've got this beautiful Tasmanian oak timber, which is, I think, for skirting boards typically, but for us it's for diorama bases. Cut that out on the drop saw. And then had some of this high density foam, which I'm going to use to build up the levels inside. And that's great to work with and cuts with the drop saw really nicely. And here you can see of the drawer, so I can get the dimensions as close as humanly possible for the bit that I have to cut out of the timber frame. Now, just before we get into the cutting of that out, I wonder if you could all do me a huge favour and indulge me for the next minute and 6 seconds and watch the following little presentation. And there will be something in it for you and perhaps something else in it for you at the end. Mums. Without. Fed you. Nursed you. Protected you. Make Mum's day. Visit jjcelebrationhampers.com. Free delivery anywhere in Australia. 10% off with the code Paladin. Don't make Mum angry. So this is my wife's business. She's just been getting it up and running online over the last few months. And we only ship within Australia. So I know there'll be lots of people watching from overseas. We can't ship overseas at this stage. But if you've got friends, family or loved ones in Australia, what a great way to let them know that you're thinking of them for birthdays or christenings. It doesn't have to be just Mother's Day, but your mum might be over here. And as an extra bonus, for anyone purchasing a hamper between now and the end of April, using the discount code Paladin, which will give you 10% off anyway, and free delivery, of course, to anywhere in Australia, In addition to that, anyone who purchases using that code will go into the draw for this Smart Kit, Dragon Smart Kit Panther G, late production. And that's coming out of my kick, and I will ship that anywhere in the world. That's it, guys. I really appreciate you listening and let me do this. We'll run this campaign over April, leading up into Mother's Day, and then there might be subsequent ones with also extra little giveaways as the year unfolds. Anyway, thank you again, and back to the show. So it's just a matter of tracing that onto the front piece of the frame, and then with the drill and jigsaw, cutting it out, and just doing a little bit of a test, and it slides in effortlessly. I want it to be firm, but not ridiculously tight. I have an issue that I often go to too low a tolerance, and things are stuck, and I have to dick around with them quite a lot. So I'm trying to be a little bit more relaxed. Then I just routed out the rebate for the front of the drawer to sit in, so it should all be completely flush when it is finished. As usual, I'm using my favourite 5mm core flute plastic corrugated sheeting to do the base. And again, just testing for tolerances to make sure that it will actually slide in and out easily. And it's a bit wobbly going in and out there, so I need to do something to make sure it's not wobbly. And the way that I'm going to fix that is just to mix up so that's some 2-part epoxy glue over here. I'm not sure if Araldite is a global brand name or not, but it's just 2-part epoxy glue. And stick that down as a couple of running rails on either side of where the drawer goes in and out. So being really careful not to get glue on the side of the drawer, and just limit it to the wood and the core flute. And that should sort that problem out. And then it was time just to arrange the high density foam to get the levels right and make sure it all fitted in. Now that's 3 layers and it's too high. I want it under the lip of the wooden edge. So of all things, I just used a dirty old wooden saw to cut a strip in half, and it cut really well and it held its line, and that's giving me the right dimensional height, so it's under the lip. And it's got some interesting effects when it's cut with a saw, and I'm just tucking that away for future use for terrain, which might have some value. So just doing some measurements now, I needed to know how much height I had from the base of the Dio base to where I want the smoke chimney appearing inside the tank. And that looked to work out to be about 100mm exactly. So I've got some brass piping which will form 2 purposes. One, to house the smoke generator so it's stable, and the second one will be to add an extension to that housing so it takes the smoke up into the interior of the tank. So there was a little bit of trial and error here in terms of how I got the 2 halves to join, because the bottom half will slide in and out with the drawer, and so when it goes back in, it needs to align with the top half that's effectively glued into the interior of the tank, and making sure that all lines up. So pretty obvious stuff happening here. I might give you a break from my droning on and just see how this evolves. So the trick here was to get the extension of the chimney lined up with the brass rod that was holding the smoke generator, and that took a little bit of measuring and tinkering to get it right. I also found that if the top of the chimney actually made firm contact with the bottom pipe, that the lack of airflow meant that the smoke didn't actually come out very well at all. So it had to be aligned, but about 0.5 mil apart. So yeah, there was lots of messing around with this, and as you can see, using different sort of methods to make sure I kept everything aligned. But eventually, through the use of some templates, and luckily the foam is easy to work with, so I could use some skewers to mark where the ends were at the varying levels. So it got it back to being relatively close. And although I can never tell for 100% certainty because I can't see what's going on inside the box, by looking down the funnel with a torchlight, I can see that it is perfectly aligned to the chimney below. I just can't tell what the gap is, but I don't get residual smoke in the box, so I think its draft is good and it's all coming up through into the upper chimney. So with the engineering largely completed, it's time to get on with doing the top of the base and starting with a layer of just tile grout. And this is quite literally just an old box of tile grout I found in the shed, and it could be 10 years old or more. I wasn't too fussed because I just wanted to start to bring the levels up towards the edge of the frame. So chuck in some water, mix it all up, and smooth it out. You can see what's going on here. I shall return after a musical interlude. So you've already seen glimpses of this up to this point, but this is just a sort of a recap on making the container for the smoke generator. So just carving out a little gap down the bottom for the wire leads to come from. Just giving it a bit of a clean up so nothing gets damaged or frayed along the journey. And then wires poke out nicely there. The brass rod goes into the base, and a little test to see of a 9-volt battery whether we can get smoke. And we can, and a test to see how the chimney draws, and it draws pretty well. So that was very pleasing, but it wasn't the end of the story, unfortunately, and a lot more work had to happen. Now I'd 3D printed a nameplate to go on the front of the drawer, so it effectively hides it, and just now marking up in terms of where it needs to sit and thinking about how that will be fixed permanently. The vision right from the start was to have the on-off button as the dot over the eye. Sadly, I didn't think of that until after I designed and made the drawer, so it wasn't actually in an ideal place, and you'll see as we get further along. It also meant some of the screws weren't where I'd really like to have them in an ideal world either, but it is what it is. So here I am just working through placement of where do I fit the on-off button, and there was a little bit of reverse engineering required to dig out the cavity for that to fit in. Also had to take a little bit out of the internal part of the actual frame as well. A lot of this was trial and error and just taking little bits away at a time because I wanted things to be a fairly snug fit, which we managed to achieve. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes running through the nameplate, and by no stretch of the imagination am I any expert, but I can use Tinkercad because it's geometric shapes, and so it's just logic and working your way through it. You don't need any art skills. So starting with a basic shape of a cube, and then just dragging that down into the dimensions that I want. I think it was 55 by 160, and then just making this a slightly smaller rectangle. And Tinkercad seems to work by adding or subtracting to a shape. So in this instance, I'm making a slightly small shape, so I get a 1mm edge all the way around, and I'm raising it up to a height so I don't go all the way through the bottom. I can then turn that in, I can center it as I just did there, then I can select it, turn it into a negative and combine them, and that will take that material out and leave me with the shape. So it's relatively easy. I have to confess that the first time I did this, it took me a hell of a lot longer to figure it all out. Then there's a nice convenient text option, and I just change the color so I can see where I'm going. And again, this is drag and manipulate to get the size that you want, and it maintains its ratio, so that's quite good. And then, of course, I don't want it sticking out as much as that, so I'm just going to pull it up a little bit through the bottom until I get it right. You can zoom in, you can turn around, obviously 360 degrees. And the other thing I want to do, as you've seen, is I just want to take the dot of the eye out, so I use a negative cylinder, and then zoom in to line that up, so I remove all the material where the raised dot of the eye would be otherwise, and make sure that's poking all the way through from one side to the other, and then combine all those objects together, and that will then take that hole out. And then the only other thing I did for this was to flip it over, and then in the back of where the on-off button hole is, I just wanted to remove again some material so that the on-off button, the fascia of that, had something to grab onto. So again, get the size as right as I could. Sometimes I just visually line things up rather than trying to center them. And then just making sure that's not too far down, combining it all, and there it is. That's taken that out. So that's only a few minutes worth of demonstration. As I said, the first time it took me probably half an hour to get the first one done, and even then it wasn't all that good and very clunky. So I think this was about the 6th iteration to get to that point. This is a close-up of the finished product. You get some print deformations or print lines or witness marks, I think. I just gave them a bit of a good old sand and then got stuck into them with the Mr. Finishing Surface Primer, I think the 1500, and that started to help. And when you see it towards the end, once it's had a few layers of paint and a few layers of gloss and clear coat, it looks pretty reasonable. So just setting up the power supply now, and I think I need 18 volts, so two 9-volt batteries. I got some nice little plastic containers from Jaina. My soldering skills have improved quite a lot through this project, so I was pretty happy with that, and it's altogether a much more robust piece of electrical work than some of my prior efforts, which have been pretty dodgy. Now I'm using heat seals to protect joins and getting things in cases and all sorts of high-tech stuff. So again, learnt the importance of tinning the end of wires where they're going to be joined. And in a little test, we can see the lights, flashing lights work. And wait for it. Yep, the smoke works. Pretty happy with that. So jobs are done. Let's move on to the next task, which I think is the paving stones. So on to the cobblestones, and this is, as I said, the biggest size diorama base that I've made. So I was going to experiment with what I thought hopefully might be a good way of doing it. So just starting off with a little test area in the back left-hand corner and getting some DAS clay into place and just trying to get that as flat as possible, but not fanatically flat because I wanted the cobblestones to be a little bit sort of uneven and undulating, but I didn't want it to protrude above the side of the wooden frame. So I'd say it's about 87.5% flat. Just came back with a flat piece of timber to try and make that a little bit more level and keep it generally all below the height of the walls. And then finally coming in with just some water to smooth it all out with a pretty stiff sort of brush. And then giving it a good old massage in, using the sculpting tool to do any of the last little bits and pieces around the edges so there's no great gaps. Now, it will shrink, it always does, but I wanted to make that as little as possible by getting it set up right at the start. And ultimately, I think you'll see when it comes back later on, it shrank maybe 0.5 mil to 1 mil away from the edges. And the last little bit of leveling, just with a clean spatula blade. And that's my first attempt at it. Not unhappy with it. I think it showed potential, but an error that I made was I should have let the clay sit longer and become firmer. So I did that with subsequent ones, and this is the technique that I used. I just ripped the bristles out of an old crappy brush and shaped the metal that normally holds the bristles into a cobblestone shape, if there's such a thing. And what that did allow me to do was to progress very quickly. It is not competition-worthy cobblestoning. There's lots of things that are wrong with it. And later on we'll zoom back a little bit and you'll see that I did it in 6 sections, the top left, top middle, top right, and then the bottom in the same order. And because I did them at different times during the week, I didn't do it exactly the same way every time. Some I pushed more than others. Some of the clay was a bit drier than other times. So it's not 100% uniform. The painting and weathering hides a lot of those sins. But for speed, I found this to be very good. And I think with a little bit of work, the concept is, like, from a proof of concept perspective, this is good. It leaves raised clay between the cobblestones, and ideally that should be not raised, it should be pushed down. So that needs a wider lip on the stamping tool. So I think there's potential to make a bigger stamping tool that does more cobblestones at the one time and 3D print that. So that's a side project that I'll be working on. But overall, not completely unhappy with how it turned out. So you've seen glimpses of the nameplate along the way and the sanding and then putting the Mr. Surfacer on. So now just getting a base coat on of black, because ultimately it will be a metallic finish and they always seem to come up much better if they're on a good solid black background. I'm using the AK brass, which I think has a very nice finish to it. And again, this is just to get the base coat down. Airbrush didn't like the metallics very much. They tended to dry on the nib relatively regularly, so I'm not sure if I needed to thin them a little bit more or if that's just the nature of the metallic tint. And then a gloss coat in preparation for some weathering. So I wanted this to be an old brassy sort of look, so I thought let's try some Russian green and see what that does. All of this is just being made up as I go along. Those of you who regularly watch, I'm no expert in anything, but I'll have a crack at most things. And sometimes you have to undo what you've done and try again. And now just coming back in with a light mist of gold. And this was giving me all sorts of problems through the airbrush. And it is absolutely pouring out, but I guarantee you I had the airbrush on the lowest PSI I could manage. Realised that I needed to make the screws look the same as the plaque, so I came back in and did a little bit of work on them. Just used a similar, very dark wash. And even though I did the plaque and the screws at completely different days and several days in between, they ended up matching pretty well. And just smearing that off, but I don't want to get it all off, and it just helped it to settle across the face of the screw as well. And then using what was hopefully a very similar wash on the plaque itself. Basically just splashing it all on, not having too much care. This is not as diluted as, say, a wash I might use on a tank or a vehicle, because I really wanted it to cling around the lettering. And then just trying to get it even so when it dried there weren't any, obviously bizarre patches. This is my Haladonian targeted spraying device, and it's just got a little bit of thinners in it, Vallejo thinners. And I thought this is the look that I wanted, but when I came back later on, it was far too much streaking down the bottom, and it would have been good if it was a sign that was on the outside of a building, but for a plaque on a display that shouldn't be left outside, I wasn't happy with how that looked, so we came back in and did a little bit of repair work on that later on. So again, just trying things. I wanted the raised lettering to be a little brighter, a little bit more prominent than the background. So I thought let's take some of that dirt and grime off. Now, the video never does this sort of stuff any good, so you have to trust me. But in person, because I'd sprayed that gold layer over the brass, doing the sanding on the lettering actually exposed some of that. So in daylight, in natural lighting, you can see it. You would argue, was it worth the effort? Because under artificial lighting, it's almost impossible to tell. It's just everything reflects. But if you go outside and stand on one leg and rub your tummy and balance the whole display on one finger at a certain angle, you see the difference. And then just thought I'd reinforce that with this was a bad idea. I thought I'd reinforce it with a soft brush that had most of the gold paint taken off it, and it sort of worked. But it did mean I had to go back in afterwards because it wasn't very easily directed, and maybe my ham-fisted approach, treating it like it was a stiff brush, contributed to that. But it got to some places where I didn't want it, so that was easy. Just went back in again with a little bit of the wash to darken up where it needed to be darkened up. And then tried the whole, let's get this weathering right again. You can tell the difference between having no gloss on it and gloss, how smoothly it runs with the gloss. So again with the squirting, and then finishing it all off with a black wash. And again, being pretty liberal and not fussed about how it sat in any one particular area. Just wanted good coverage. Now, I thought I was filming this, but my card was full, so I did then come in before doing this final gloss coat. I did come back in with a small piece of very clean rag and water and tried to polish it so it looked like it had been polished, and that got a lot of the surface black off and left it almost exactly as I envisaged it would look. So a long, laborious process, got there in the finish, and that's it matching up to some box corners that I bought that will go on the stand itself, or the diorama base itself. So pretty close. Happy with that. So outside now, and that's to do the staining of the diorama base, the Tasmanian oak. And I have previously used both mahogany and walnut. So this is the mahogany, and again, the difference between natural light and artificial light. After I'd put this on and done the two coats and wiped it down and all that sort of stuff, and you can see what's going on here, it was too red, and that's not a surprise, I guess, for mahogany, but it was really red. So I'm not sure if it was a different brand to what I'd used previously. I didn't like it all that much, and so what you won't see is me then going back in after this had dried fully and giving it a coat of walnut, and that is what you ultimately see as the finished product. And I was pretty happy with how that all turned out. So need to do this outside because this has got a very strong odour to it. I get away with it when I'm doing the smaller diobases inside because it's not open for very long and I don't use very much, and I'm probably slack in doing that. But I needed to do this outside because it is quite strong, maybe because it was new as well. And then wiping off the excess, so that removes brush marks, and hopefully if there's some loose bristles that have fallen off along the way, you can get rid of those. And it just helps it to smooth in with the grain of the timber as well. And then literally 15 minutes after I had packed up and gone inside, we heard a God Almighty crack sound and thumping sound from outside, and I walked out to find this significantly large gum tree branch that had fallen from the next door neighbour's tree, pretty much right where I had been working only 15 minutes earlier. So I'm going to claim that I dodged a bullet there, or a gum tree branch bullet there. Otherwise, this might have been one of the great unfinished YouTube videos that never got published. So time to revisit the electrics, and I wasn't happy with the flashing lights that I had bought because they look like more like blinker lights, whereas making my own were more flickering. So that was the first change I made. Then I had a fairly lengthy challenge with power supply. So the main issue that I was experiencing there was the smoke generator claims it needs 9 to 14 volts to run. I particularly checked that with the guy at the shop, and he said it would run on 9-volt battery. So I thought that was okay, and I didn't read the packaging on the flicking lights. I just made an assumption that they would draw 3 volts, so I thought I needed 12 volts, and the two 9-volt batteries should have done that for me. The first problem was that was too much voltage, and it burnt out one of the globes in the commercial flickering lights that I'd bought. So had to make my own lights as I just showed. And then the second issue was it was draining the batteries. So I had the situation where I'd put new batteries in, I'd test it, everything would work really well, and then when I ran it again later on, or tested it again later on, the smoke generator would start to struggle. The lights that I'd made would always work, but it struggled. So I was a bit perplexed behind that and started to think, well, hang on a minute, this is a bit bizarre. What I realised then I'd done was I'd run the lights that I made in serial, so they were each drawing 3 volts. So I had 9 volts potentially coming for the smoke generator, and another 9 volts for the lights, which was draining too much of the power. It was taking up the full 18 volts. Look, I won't go into the whole horrible lengthy story, but what I eventually discovered was that the smoke generator probably needed to be drawing 12 volts for it to run properly, and that meant with 18 volts, I only had 7 volts left for the lights. Running them in parallel meant that they were only drawing about 2.7 volts, so it took me up to almost 15 volts. The batteries were still draining pretty fast, so I literally brought 8 9-volt batteries over the course of this testing, and that wasn't sustainable. So I went through my box of stuff that I don't throw out, and a lot of that is power adapters, and found this one which has an output of 19 volts. And since putting this in and drawing the power from the mains, everything's worked perfectly, no dramas whatsoever. So we're in the home straight now and just finishing off the cobblestone. So this is just some really cheap paint. I think it was like $2.99 acrylic paint from the local supermarket, and an equally really cheap brush from the same place. And this is just to get some base tones down. So you can see I rubbed some stain into it just to get it off the brush and give it some undercoat, which seemed to work all right. And the rest is pretty evident, just mixing up some grey and going bonkers. So you've had me crapping on for far too long now, so a bit of music for you see this, and come back and just talk about a couple of the specifics in the painting, and then we are just about cooked. So finishing off with the European earth over all the what ultimately finished up to be individually painted cobblestones, and then just using some thinners here to work them into the cracks, and that will dry and help that pigment to set and clean them off the top of the cobbles as well. Then I gave them a pretty vigorous rub with a isopropyl alcohol soaked wipe, just trying to get the vast majority of it off and leave the rest of it in the cracks and the low points. And then using a slightly darker pigment a bit more selectively in certain places, but not sprinkled over everywhere like I did with the first European Earth one. More isopropyl alcohol to help set that in place in the low spots and wipe it off on the highlights. So looking good, but still a little bit too much colour variation for me. I really love this AK Australian Black because it's quite blue, and maybe because of where I live, but used to seeing most of the cobblestone streets in the older parts of Melbourne are bluestone, so it looks familiar to my eye. It probably is a really, really bad decision to depict a set of cobblestones in a Dutch town, but really happy with how that finished up. So promise you we're in the home straight now. It's a much longer video than I typically do. So this was some horrible cheap Chinese felt that I bought online ages ago, and when it turned up I thought, God, I hate this, it's so thin and horrible. But it actually is the perfect felt for this dio base with what I want to do with the antique brass corners. So just a case of measuring it up. It's a self-adhesive green felt and relatively easy to work with if you take your time. And for those of you who have watched previous videos, you'll know that once I did this with self-adhesive felt and I stretched it to make it fit, and that put it out of square and it was all over the shop, and I had to do patching in the middle. I couldn't get the joins and it was basically a complete and absolute cluster. So very careful this time, very slowly applying it and just peeling the backing off, basically inch by inch or centimetre by centimetre to make sure I had no bubbles and I wasn't stretching it, and worth taking the effort to not just slap it on as I may have done previously. So the critical moment is lining up the two halves to make sure you don't get a horrible gap, and again that's just a matter of taking time and definitely not stretching. This is where it can all go pear-shaped, but once you've got it started, it's rinse and repeat as you did for the first half. Just a matter of smoothing it all out and then trimming the edges. So the last thing to do was just to put the little brass box corners on, and these are again some cheapies bought from China that took forever to turn up, but quite nice and fixed in a couple of places. So I didn't want the nails to be showing in the front, so I had to just make sure I had them lined up right to get them in the side. A little bit fiddly with my big fat sausage fingers, but eventually worked my way through it and got them all in, and I think quite a good match with the nameplate in the finish, which in the final reveal photos that should show up pretty nicely. Now I didn't cause that gash in the timber through doing this. That was caused from me carelessly walking back into the house with it after I'd done the gloss coat and banging it into the wall like an absolute twerp. And the very, very last thing I did was I wanted the on-off button wasn't holding the paint, so I stole an earring, don't tell anyone, from the good lady wife's stock and cut the top off one and smashed down the bottom one, and you'll see it in the final reveal. Made a little button that I could pin into the on-off button. And so that's it, guys. That's where it will sit in the cave. It'll be centre place of the main shelves, which are normally just for the stash. And the cable will run down behind the cork notice board and plug into the main, so it's a good spot for it. Pretty happy with how it came up. As normal, you can always see things in these real close-up photos that you think, oh God, why did I do that? But anyway, I overall am pretty happy with it. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I know it was a bit longer than normal, but there was a fair bit of ground to cover. Here's a bit of a sneak peek of what it ultimately will look like in the finished diorama. Take care everyone, look after yourselves, I'll catch you in the next one. So if you like this video, hit the thumbs up and share. Subscribe if you're not already a subscriber and ding the donger. And of course leave a comment because I love reading them. Cheers!